Hello, my name is Mike, and my topic is on free speech in public schools. So let's get started here. First, I think it's important to delineate what the First Amendment says and what it guarantees us as citizens. So here it clearly states that Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So here it's just basically summed up what it covers, but there are a lot of misconceptions, and that's what I look to dispel in my research paper. So the misconceptions are, and I know a lot of us have heard people commonly say, "Oh, it's a free country, I can say what I want," but that's not necessarily true. And so freedom of speech does not cover things like hate speech, speech that incites violence, threats, defamation. And one example that I wanted to give was, for instance, in people typically post a lot of things on social media. So if your employer finds that you're making threats or just things that go against the company policy, they have the right to fire you. And people often believe, oh, they're violating my freedom of speech, but that's not true because company policies supersede your perceived rights to free speech. So, with that in mind, I wanted to talk about some of the court cases that I researched in regards to free speech in public schools. The first one being Timothy Kirkland versus Northside Independent School District in 1989. And this one was regarding academic freedom. So I thought this one was important, especially since we're all going to be teachers. And in social science, you, or I would at least like a lot of freedom to be able to determine what I teach and how I teach it within the, by still meeting standards and the curriculum that is being presented. So in this specific case, Timothy Kirkland was adding books to a list for his students to read, and a lot of them were not approved by the school district itself or his administration. So here is an example of a teacher who got into trouble with his administrators because they told him basically that he was not allowed to add the book titles that he was trying to have students to read. A lot of them were nonfiction. I mean, a lot of them were actually fiction books for a history class, which is a little, I would say, is unheard of. But I don't know what his rationale behind that was. But long story short was Kirkland decided to sue the school district, citing that they were violating his free speech rights. But the courts ruled against him because the school had a pretty firm policy that was laid out and protocol that he had to follow, where he basically had to present the list to his administration and to the parents and get the okay from them so he can present whatever sort of material he wanted to teach his students. But he went around everybody and just gave it to his students and got the books either way. So rather than to argue the technicalities of him uh, or his freedom of speech being violated, the courts decided to rule on the side of the schools, simply citing policy. So that's one of the key precedents that I've seen court rulings err on the side of, being if schools have certain rules and the teachers don't follow them, then they just automatically side with the teachers regardless. I mean the schools. Um, the second case here was Karp versus Becken, and Karp was a student who was protesting the firing of one of his teachers. So one of the things that we see in contemporary times a lot is students wanting to protest. Just a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, we saw students protesting and walking out for climate change. So I thought that was an interesting topic to go into. And in this case, the school was um, they suspended Karp because he had signs protesting, and they were trying to argue that he was creating a disruption and it was a public safety issue. However, the courts found that Karp was posing no threats, he was causing no commotion, he was just simply voicing his opinion, and that being that this teacher was wrongfully fired and he wanted him reinstated. So they went to court. Karp won, and that was a victory for free speech as far as students are concerned. Um, the next case here, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Gobitis versus Minersville School District in 1973. This was a religious-based ruling. So Gobitis was a parent. He's a Jehovah's Witness, and his two students were uh, expelled from school because they would not salute the flag. According to Jehovah's Witnesses, they cannot salute the flag because it goes against their religion, and they cite bearing false witness, and that the only thing that they bow to is God. So um, Gobitis sued the school district and argued his case. And what I found interesting about this one was that a lot of court rulings went against Jehovah's Witnesses prior to this case. So it was kind of an uphill battle, but one of the judges was actually I think they said a Quaker, so he was a little less biased against Jehovah's Witnesses, but he ultimately ruled in favor of uh, the father, citing that the his kids' convictions were honest and they weren't causing any harm, they weren't disrupting anybody, they were truly holding to their values and just wouldn't salute the flag, not because of any um, ill will against the country or anything like that. They just felt that it was wrong um, to do it under religious pretenses. So he ended up winning. The next one here, Roberts versus Madigan, is also a religious-based ruling, but in this case, Roberts was a teacher in an elementary school who had religious books for his school, for his class library, and he would routinely read the Bible during class time, and he even had a poster in his wall, um, which had a biblical verse on it. And the principal, Madigan, um, stated multiple times that that was against school policy and that there had to be a strict separation between church and state. Because I think during a parent-teacher conference, one of the parents was offended by the religious symbolism and the books that she saw in the classroom. So Robert sued. He ended up losing the case because the courts determined that um, the students had the right to not be indoctrinated or be exposed to religious symbolism or literature, and that the teacher ultimately was going against the policy that the schools pretty much laid out because he was doing it within um, business hours, and that was just not allowed. Students shouldn't be exposed to religion, and again, they sided with the principal because it was a clear violation of the notion of separation between church and state. And finally, Melton B. Young. Melton was a student who was wearing Confederate flag garb to his school, and this was in the context of desegregation. So a lot of schools banned Confederate flags in their school premises because they felt that it promoted violence and incited violence against their African American students. So Melton, you can argue, was just doing it to be controversial and provocative. He wore a jacket with a Confederate flag on the back and was arguing that it was free speech. However, the courts ruled against him because they felt that he was just doing it to cause a commotion and to be antagonistic against his African American peers. So they ruled against him and decided that it wasn't a violation of his free speech. He was just trying to um, cause um, just a disruption to the school in general. So yeah, those were the court cases that I decided to look into, and I also looked into some policies that the National Social Science Standards lay out, and they do favor free speech, but they always emphasize how teachers have to um, just let everyone know, parents, administration, principals and everyone what you're trying to teach. Uh, if you're introducing certain books that aren't in the curriculum, you have to have a justification for them and just be transparent with your decisions. And you're pretty much protected all the way as a teacher. But in the case, for instance, of Kirkland, where he just kind of went around everybody and then argued the case that his rights were being violated, it was really easy for the school district to just note their policy and win the case that way. So, yeah, that's basically my research paper in a nutshell.